Welcome back to the channel. You are in for a wild ride today with a story full of betrayal, royal secrets, and a healer who unknowingly saves the most powerful wolf in the kingdom. But before we dive into the drama, do me a huge favor and hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and helps more people find these stories. I love seeing how far our pack reaches. So pause for just a second and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are listening from today. Represent your city and country. And hey, don't be a silent listener. As we go through the story, keep those comments coming. I want to know your reactions. Let me know which plot twist shocked you the most and mark your favorite scenes. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a new upload. All right, grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's find out what happens when a simple healer accidentally saves the Alpha King's son. In the heart of the most fortified stronghold in the Shifter territories, safety was an illusion. While Alpha King Garrick ruled with an iron fist, he never suspected the dagger pointed at his heart was held by his own brother. Tonight, the target wasn't the king, but his most precious weakness, his son. Prince Bram, the future of the pack, lay unconscious beneath a pile of soiled bedsheets, drugged and helpless. As the laundry cart rattled toward the exit, a single bump in the road would change everything. This isn't just a kidnapping, it's a coup. And the only thing standing between the heir and certain death is a reclusive healer who has no idea that the injured pup crashing into her garden is royalty. Chapter 1. The Laundry Cart. The stone walls of Castle Blackwood stood as a testament to centuries of strength, yet for Finch, they felt more like the closing jaws of a trap. He paused outside the heavy oak door of the royal nursery, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs that he feared everyone could hear. He was not a warrior or a strategist. He was a simple laundry servant who had spent 20 years scrubbing stains from velvet doublets. But tonight, the stain he was about to create would never wash out. He adjusted his grip on the handle of the large wheeled wooden cart filled with the day's collected linens, his palms slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the castle's temperature. Lord Merrick had promised him enough gold to buy a farm in the south, far away from the biting winters and the pack politics, but only if Finch delivered the package tonight. He pushed the door open, the hinges well-oiled and silent. Inside, the nursery was warm, illuminated by the dying embers of the hearth. 6-year-old Prince Bram was seated on the plush rug, pushing a wooden soldier across a map of the kingdom. The boy looked up, his golden eyes wide and trusting, expecting his nanny to return with his evening milk. Instead, he saw the laundryman, a figure he had seen 1,000 times but never truly noticed. Finch forced a trembling smile onto his face, reaching into his pocket for the rag soaked in the sweet-smelling solution Dr. Oren had prepared. It had to be quick. Before the young prince could ask a question or let out a whimper, Finch crossed the room in 3 long strides and pressed the cloth firmly over the boy's nose and mouth. Bram thrashed for only a second, his small limbs flailing against Finch's chest, before his eyes rolled back and he went limp. Finch gasped, dropping the cloth as if it burned him. He stared at the unconscious heir to the throne, terrified by what he had just done. If King Garrick walked in now, Finch would be torn apart before he could draw a breath. Panic seized him, sharp and urgent. He scooped the small boy up, his body surprisingly light, and hurried back to the laundry cart. With frantic, clumsy movements, he burrowed a space deep within the pile of soiled bedsheets and tunics, laying the prince down and covering him completely with the heavy, musky fabric. The journey through the fortress corridors was a gauntlet of terror. Finch kept his head down, pushing the cart with a steady, rhythmic pace that belied his internal screaming. Every shadow looked like the king, every echo sounded like an accusation. He passed 2 sentries at the service entrance, men he had known for years. They barely glanced at him, waving him through with bored expressions, completely unaware that the future of their kingdom was hidden beneath the dirty laundry rolling right past their boots. Finch held his breath until he was clear of the iron gates, the cool night wind hitting his face as he steered the cart onto the gravel path leading toward the river, where the linens were usually washed. But tonight, he did not turn toward the river. Once he was beyond the range of the torchlight, he veered onto the rough, unpaved logging road that led into the dense forest. The wheels of the cart groaned in protest against the uneven ground, jolting violently over roots and stones. Finch pushed harder, driven by the fear of Lord Merrick's wrath. He needed to reach the rendezvous point where the hired rogues were waiting. Suddenly, the left wheel slammed into a deep pothole, nearly tipping the entire cart over. The violent impact shook the contents aggressively, causing the pile of linens to shift dangerously. Deep within the mound of fabric, the jolt was enough to snap the fragile hold of the sedative. A small hand shot out from beneath the sheets, grasping the side of the cart, followed by a low, confused growl that made Finch's blood run cold. Chapter 2. Into the Woods. The growl was low, guttural, and undeniably primal. It was the sound of a wolf, even a young one, recognizing a threat. Finch froze, his hands gripping the handle of the cart so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared at the mound of laundry as the sheets shifted, and a small, tousled head emerged. Prince Bram blinked, his eyes unfocused and swimming with the remnants of the drug, but fear was rapidly sharpening his senses. The boy looked around, seeing the dark canopy of the forest instead of his warm nursery walls, and then looked at Finch. Recognition dawned on his young face, followed immediately by betrayal. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry for his father. The instinct to survive, ancient and inherent in his bloodline, took over completely. Finch lunged forward, trying to push the boy back down into the cart. "Stay down, you little brat," he hissed, desperation making his voice crack. He couldn't let the prince escape. Merrick would skin him alive. He grabbed Bram's shoulder, his fingers digging into the small tunic. Bram reacted instantly. He twisted his body with surprising agility and sank his teeth into the fleshy part of Finch's hand. The laundry servant screamed, a high-pitched sound that echoed too loudly in the quiet woods, and yanked his hand back, blood welling from the bite marks. It was the opening Bram needed. He scrambled over the side of the heavy wooden cart, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. The drug still made the world spin, tilting the ground beneath his feet, but Bram forced his legs to move. He ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the man who smelled of fear and deception. The forest was a wall of darkness, immense and terrifying compared to the manicured gardens of the fortress. Bram sprinted off the path and into the underbrush, branches whipping against his face and stinging his eyes. Behind him, he heard Finch cursing and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots hitting the earth. The servant was giving chase, but he was clumsy and loud, crashing through the foliage like a wounded bear. Bram was smaller, faster, and naturally quieter, but his coordination was compromised. Suddenly, a distant howl cut through the night air, a sound that made every hair on Bram's arm stand up. It wasn't the harmonious, communicative howl of his father's pack. It was jagged, hungry, and cruel. Rogues. Merrick's hired knives had heard the scream and were closing in. Terror surged through Bram, giving him a burst of adrenaline that cleared some of the fog from his mind. He pushed harder, his breathing ragged, his small chest burning. He needed to find a place to hide, somewhere small where grown men couldn't follow. He vaulted over a fallen log, but his landing was sloppy. His foot caught on a jagged, exposed root, and he went down hard, his knee smashing against a stone. Pain exploded up his leg, hot and blinding. Bram bit his lip to stifle a cry, tears pricking his eyes. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled under his weight. He was hurt, alone, and being hunted by wolves who would not hesitate to kill a child. He dragged himself under the shelter of a large fern, pressing his back against the rough bark of an oak tree. He could hear them now, not just Finch, but others. Heavy paws on dry leaves, the snapping of twigs, and low snarls that drifted closer with every passing second. They were hunting him by scent. Bram squeezed his eyes shut, trying to remember the lessons his father had taught him about masking his trail, but panic had wiped his mind blank. He was just a boy, lost in the dark, waiting for the monsters to find him. Chapter 3. The Sanctuary. The forest floor was damp and cold, seeping through Bram's clothes as he dragged himself forward, inch by painful inch. His injured leg throbbed with a relentless rhythm, a dull fire that made every movement an ordeal. The sounds of pursuit had faded slightly, but he knew better than to believe he was safe. Rogues played with their food. They didn't just lose it. He had to keep moving. Up ahead, through a break in the dense trees, he saw a flicker of warm, orange light. It was steady, unlike the erratic moonlight filtering through the leaves. A house. Hope, fragile and desperate, fluttered in his chest. He pulled himself toward the beacon, crawling over mossy stones and through thickets of thorns that tore at his clothes. He broke through the tree line and collapsed onto a patch of cultivated grass. Before him stood a small, sturdy cabin made of timber and stone, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. It looked peaceful, a world away from the nightmare he had just escaped. Bram tried to stand one last time, managing to hobble a few steps before his strength gave out completely. He crashed into a wooden fence, the impact sending a clatter of gardening tools tumbling to the ground. The noise was deafening in the silence. He lay there, gasping for air, waiting for the door to open or for the rogues to emerge from the shadows to finish him off. The cabin door swung open, spilling light onto the porch. A woman stepped out, holding a lantern high. This was Sam. She didn't look like a warrior or a guard. She wore a simple woolen dress and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair was loose, framing a face that was alert but not unkind. She scanned the yard, her gaze landing on the small, crumpled form by her fence. She didn't scream or run. Instead, she moved with a swift, practical purpose. She crossed the yard in seconds, kneeling beside him. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice low and soothing, like a calm river. "I've got you." She saw the blood on his leg and the terror in his eyes, and her expression hardened. Not at him, but at whatever had done this. "Find him! He can't have gone far!" The shout came from the woods, harsh and close. Bram flinched violently, gripping Sam's shawl. Sam's head snapped up, looking toward the tree line. She understood immediately. She didn't ask who he was. She simply scooped him up in her arms, ignoring the strain, and carried him quickly around the side of the cabin. She kicked open a low, hidden door that led to a root cellar. "Stay here," she whispered, placing him on a pile of burlap sacks. "Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." She closed the cellar doors and sprinkled a handful of pungent dried herbs over the cracks to mask his scent. Moments later, 3 men burst into the clearing. They were rough, smelling of stale ale and bloodlust. One of them, a scarred rogue with yellow eyes, stepped toward Sam, who was now standing on her porch, holding a basket of firewood as if she had just been attending to chores. "You," the rogue growled. "Did you see a boy run through here? Small, limping." Sam looked at him with cool indifference, her heartbeat steady. "I've seen no one but you lot trampling my herbs," she said, her voice dripping with annoyance rather than fear. "If you're looking for lost children, try the village. Now get off my land before I set my wards on you." The rogues hesitated. Witches and healers were tricky business, and they didn't have time for curses. Snarling, the leader signaled the others, and they turned back into the woods, convinced their prey had bypassed the cabin. Chapter 4. The Healer's Touch. The cellar was dark and smelled of earth and apples, but to Bram it felt like the safest place in the world. He huddled on the burlap sacks, listening to the heavy footsteps above fade away. Silence returned, heavy and thick, until the cellar doors creaked open again. The woman, Sam, descended the wooden steps, the lantern casting long shadows against the stone walls. Her face was softer now, the fierce protector he had glimpsed outside replaced by a gentle caretaker. She knelt beside him, placing the lantern on an overturned crate. "They're gone," she said simply. "You're safe here." She reached out a hand, waiting for his permission before touching him. Bram hesitated, then nodded slowly. She examined his leg with efficient, practiced hands. The cut from the jagged root was deep and angry, the skin around it swollen. "Nasty fall," she commented, not expecting an answer. She opened a small satchel she had brought down with her, pulling out a jar of greenish salve and clean linen bandages. "This might sting a bit, but it will stop the infection." As she applied the salve, a cool, numbing sensation washed over the wound, instantly dulling the throbbing pain. Bram let out a long breath he didn't realize he had been holding. She worked with a focus that mesmerized him, her hands steady and sure. She didn't treat him like a prince or a victim. She treated him like a broken thing that needed mending. "I'm Sam," she said quietly as she wrapped the linen around his knee. "Do you have a name, little one?" Bram looked at her. He had been taught never to give his name to strangers, especially outside the fortress walls. He shook his head. Sam didn't press him. She seemed to understand that trust was earned, not demanded. She finished tying the bandage and sat back on her heels. "Hungry?" she asked. He nodded, his stomach giving a treacherous growl. She smiled, a genuine expression that lit up her eyes. She produced a piece of bread and a slice of cheese from her pocket. "Eat. You need your strength." Bram ate ravenously, the simple food tasting better than any royal banquet. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion crashed over him like a tidal wave. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite the strange surroundings, the presence of the woman made him feel secure. He curled up on the sacks, clutching a piece of the burlap like a blanket. Sam watched him, her heart aching for this silent, terrified child. She stayed with him until his breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. As she watched, a shimmer passed over the boy's form. His skin seemed to ripple, and in the blink of an eye, the boy was gone. In his place lay a small, golden-furred wolf pup, curled into a tight ball. Sam gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had suspected he was a shifter. Many in these lands were. But seeing the transformation was always startling. And not just any shifter. The golden hue of his fur was rare, a mark of high lineage, often associated with the Alpha bloodlines. She realized then that this wasn't just a lost child from the village. She had harbored a wolf of significant importance, and the men hunting him weren't just common thugs. They were assassins. She reached out, hesitating, then gently stroked the soft fur between the pup's ears. He didn't wake, but leaned into her touch, letting out a small, contented huff. The danger was far greater than she had imagined. Chapter 5. The Royal Decree. Morning light filtered through the cracks in the cellar door, waking Sam from a restless sleep. She had spent the night in the rocking chair she dragged downstairs, keeping watch over the sleeping pup. The boy had shifted back to human form sometime before dawn, now looking small and vulnerable in the dusty light. Sam knew she couldn't keep him here. It wasn't safe for him, and frankly, she didn't have the resources to protect him if the rogues returned in greater numbers. She needed information. Leaving a fresh pitcher of water and a loaf of bread for the boy, she locked the cellar from the outside, for his safety, and set off toward the village on foot. The village was buzzing with a frantic energy that set Sam's nerves on edge. Groups of guards from the fortress were patrolling the streets, stopping carts and questioning merchants. This was unusual. The fortress rarely interfered with village life unless something catastrophic had occurred. Sam pulled her shawl tighter and kept her head down, heading for the market square. As she approached the community board, she saw a crowd gathered around a large, freshly pasted parchment. Pushing her way through the throng, she looked up and felt the blood drain from her face. It was a royal decree, stamped with the king's heavy wax seal. Missing. Crown Prince Bram. Below the bold text was a charcoal sketch of the boy sleeping in her cellar. The resemblance was undeniable. The decree promised a reward of 10,000 gold coins to anyone who returned the prince safely, and death to anyone found harboring him. The whispers around her were wild and varied. Some said he was taken by rebels. Others claimed a monster from the woods had snatched him from his bed. Sam backed away slowly, her mind racing. The Alpha King's son. She had saved the heir to the throne. The realization brought a wave of nausea. The rogues she had tricked weren't random kidnappers. This was a coordinated attack on the crown. If she was caught with him, she could be accused of the kidnapping herself. But if she did nothing, those men would eventually find him. She thought of the gold, enough to live comfortably for 10 lifetimes, but dismissed it instantly. The money meant nothing if the boy was dead. Her duty was clear. She wasn't just returning a lost child. She was returning the future of the kingdom. She hurried back to the cabin, her pace brisk and determined. She had to get him back to the fortress, but she had to be careful. When she unlocked the cellar, Bram was awake, sitting up and clutching the bread she had left. He looked at her with wide, fearful eyes as she descended. "I know who you are," Sam said softly, kneeling in front of him. "You're Prince Bram." The boy stiffened, his muscles tensing to run. Sam held up her hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you. I saw the posters in the village. Your father is looking for you. He's turning the world upside down to find you." At the mention of his father, Bram's lower lip trembled. "I'm going to take you home," Sam promised, her voice firm with resolve. "I'm going to walk you right up to the king myself. No one will touch you while I'm breathing." Bram searched her face for any sign of deception, found none, and finally nodded, scrambling into her arms and burying his face in her shoulder. Chapter 6. The Wounded King. The journey to the royal fortress was a tense blur of shadowed forest paths and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Sam kept a firm grip on Bram's hand, her senses extended to their limit as she navigated the ancient woods. Every snapping twig sounded like a pursuing rogue, and every rustle of leaves sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins. Bram, despite his injury, moved with a surprising resilience, his trust in Sam anchoring him against the terror of the previous night. By the time the towering black stone walls of the fortress came into view, looming against the gray sky like a mountain of man-made rock, both of them were exhausted and coated in dust. The castle was an intimidating beast, its banners snapping violently in the wind, depicting the snarling wolf crest of the royal house. Approaching the main gate was a gamble. The guards were on high alert, their armor clanking as they paced the battlements. When Sam stepped out of the tree line, holding the hand of a child wrapped in a peasant's cloak, a dozen crossbows were immediately leveled at her chest. "Halt!" the captain of the guard bellowed, his voice booming across the open ground. "State your business or be fired upon." Sam didn't flinch. She pulled the hood back from Bram's face, revealing the golden eyes and unmistakable features of the missing heir. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Weapons were lowered in a clatter of steel, and the massive iron gates groaned open with a heavy, grinding sound that vibrated in Sam's chest. They were ushered inside with frantic urgency. Guards surrounded them, not as captors, but as a protective phalanx, shielding the prince with their bodies. They moved quickly through the courtyard and into the cavernous interior of the keep. The fortress was cold, the stone walls radiating a chill that seemed to seep into the marrow. Servants stopped in their tracks, bowing low and whispering fervently as they saw the young prince alive. Sam felt out of place in her simple dress and worn boots, a speck of dirt in a palace of velvet and steel. But she held her head high. She wasn't here for them. She was here to finish what she started. The doors to the throne room were thrown open, revealing a hall of immense grandeur. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows on the tapestries. At the far end, seated on a throne carved from obsidian, was King Garrick. Sam had expected a monster of a man, a warrior king radiating power and vitality. What she saw stopped her breath in her throat. Garrick was undeniably large, his shoulders broad and his frame commanding, but there was a shocking frailty to him. His skin was an unhealthy shade of gray, stretched tight over his cheekbones, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He gripped the armrests of the throne as if they were the only things keeping him upright. "Bram!" The king's voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking visibly. Bram broke free from Sam's grip and ran across the polished floor. "Father!" The boy collided with the king, burying his face in Garrick's tunic. Garrick fell back onto the throne, clutching his son with a desperation that was painful to watch. He buried his nose in the boy's hair, inhaling his scent to confirm he was real. For a long moment, the room was silent, save for the king's ragged breathing. When Garrick finally looked up, his gaze locked onto Sam. His eyes were a piercing, icy blue, burning with a mix of gratitude and intense scrutiny. He looked like a wounded lion, dangerous, unpredictable, and barely holding onto his strength. Chapter 7. Integrity over gold. The emotional reunion in the throne room slowly settled into a heavy, quiet tension. King Garrick remained seated, his hand resting protectively on Bram's shoulder as the boy recounted a fragmented version of his escape. Bram spoke of the laundry cart, the fall in the woods, and the kindness of the woman who had hidden him in her cellar. As the boy spoke, Garrick's gaze never left Sam. She stood alone in the center of the vast room, feeling the weight of the court's attention. Lord Merrick, the king's brother, stood to the side, his face a mask of practiced relief, though Sam noticed his fingers twitching nervously against the hilt of his decorative sword. When Bram finished, Garrick cleared his throat, a wet rattling sound that made the nearby guards flinch. He gestured to a steward, who hurried forward struggling under the weight of a heavy wooden chest. The steward placed it at Sam's feet and flipped the lid open. Inside, gold coins glimmered in the torchlight, a fortune that could buy a dozen estates, a title, and a life of absolute leisure. "You have returned my heart to me," Garrick said, his voice weak but laced with the authority of his station. "The reward was promised, and the crown honors its debts. Take it. It is yours, along with the eternal favor of the pack." Sam looked down at the gold. It was more money than she had ever seen, enough to ensure she never had to forage for herbs or mend a roof again. But looking at it felt wrong. It felt like blood money. She looked up, meeting Garrick's intense stare. "I didn't bring him back for a payout, Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady and clear, echoing slightly in the large hall. "I brought him back because a child belongs with his father. I don't want your gold." A ripple of shock went through the courtiers. No one refused gold from the king. It was unheard of. Garrick's eyebrows drew together, his expression shifting from gratitude to confusion. "You refuse? Do you think it insufficient? I can double it." Sam shook her head, taking a small step back. "I think it is excessive for an act of basic decency. I saw a hurt child. I helped him. Putting a price tag on that cheapens it. Keep your coin. Use it to find the men who did this." She turned to leave, intending to walk out of the castle and back to her quiet life in the woods. She had done her duty. "Wait." Garrick's command stopped her before she reached the doors. He stood up again, pushing past the pain in his body. He walked down the steps of the dais, moving slowly but with purpose, until he stood directly in front of her. Up close, the scent of sickness on him was overpowering, masking the natural musk of the Alpha. "Integrity," he murmured, looking at her as if she were a rare specimen he couldn't quite categorize. "I have a castle full of sycophants who would sell their own mothers for a single one of those coins, and you turn down a chest full." He looked down at Bram, who was watching Sam with wide, pleading eyes. "My son trusts you. He feels safe with you. I need that safety here. I cannot offer you the anonymity of your woods, but I can offer you a position. Stay. Be his caretaker. Guard him when I cannot." Chapter 8. The Viper's Nest. Accepting the king's offer had felt like the right decision in the throne room, but as Sam stood in the center of her new quarters within the fortress, a cold seed of doubt began to take root. The room was luxurious, with tapestries covering the stone walls and a fire crackling in the hearth, situated directly adjacent to Prince Bram's nursery. Yet, the luxury did nothing to mask the oppressive atmosphere of the castle. It felt less like a home and more like a battleground where the weapons were smiles and whispers. Sam unpacked her meager belongings, a few dresses, her mortar and pestle, and her satchel of dried herbs, placing them on the grand oak vanity. They looked remarkably out of place, much like her. A sharp knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Before she could answer, the heavy wood swung open. Lord Merrick strode in, not waiting for an invitation. He was a handsome man, sharing the same strong jawline as his brother. But where Garrick was rugged and imposing, Merrick was polished and slick. He wore a velvet doublet that cost more than Sam's entire village, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "So," he purred, walking around the room and inspecting her things with a look of mild distaste. "The savior of the hour settles in. I wanted to personally welcome you, Sam, was it? It is quite a tale. How you managed to find the boy when my best trackers could not." The accusation was subtle, buried under a layer of charm, but Sam heard it loud and clear. He was implying she had been involved, or at the very least, that her story didn't add up. "I didn't find him, my lord," Sam replied, keeping her voice neutral. "He found me. I simply opened the door." Merrick stopped in front of her, his cologne cloying and sweet. "Indeed, a stroke of luck. My brother is sentimental, offering a stranger a place in the inner sanctum. But be warned, the castle is not a cottage in the woods. It is easy to get lost here, or hurt." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Before Sam could respond, another figure entered the room. This man was tall, thin, and wore the pristine white robes of a physician. Dr. Oren. He carried a leather medical bag and looked at Sam with open disdain. "Lord Merrick." He nodded, ignoring Sam entirely at first. "The king is asking for you." He then turned his cold reptilian gaze on Sam. "And you must be the herbalist. I've heard you dabbled in treating the prince's leg with some forest sludge?" He sneered. "While I appreciate the amateur effort, the prince is now under my care. I will not have you interfering with his health or the king's with your roots and berries. Stick to reading bedtime stories, girl, and leave the medicine to the professionals." Sam bristled. She had been trained by her mother, one of the finest healers the territory had ever known. She knew more about the medicinal properties of plants than this man likely knew about his own children. "My sludge stopped the infection and closed the wound, doctor," she said, meeting his gaze evenly. "But I will be sure to stay out of your way. I wouldn't want to distract you from your impressive results with the king." It was a risky jab, referencing Garrick's poor health, and she saw Oren's eyes narrow into dangerous slits. The air between them crackled with hostility. Chapter 9. The Genetic Lie. Life in the fortress quickly fell into a routine, though it was a routine underscored by constant vigilance. Sam spent her days with Bram, creating a bubble of safety within the nursery. They read books, played strategy games, and she taught him the names of the plants she could spot from the high windows. But her eyes were always open, watching the flow of the castle, particularly the movements of Dr. Oren. The physician moved through the halls like a specter, his white robes a stark contrast to the gloom of the stone corridors. Everyone treated him with a reverence Sam found disturbing, considering his primary patient, the king, was visibly deteriorating by the day. One afternoon, while Bram was napping, Sam slipped out of the nursery and made her way toward the king's chambers. She told the guards she needed to ask the king about Bram's schedule, a plausible excuse that got her past the heavy oak doors. Inside, the room was dim, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight to block out the sun. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of sickness and harsh chemical astringents. Garrick was sitting in a high-backed chair by the fire, a blanket draped over his legs. He looked even worse than he had on the day of her arrival. His skin was translucent, the veins beneath showing blue and stark, and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead despite the chill in the room. Dr. Oren was there, standing beside the king with a silver tray. On the tray sat a small crystal goblet filled with a thick purple liquid. "Drink, Your Majesty," Oren urged, his voice smooth and professional. "It will stabilize the tremors. The genetic stress disorder is aggressive today." Garrick's hand shook violently as he reached for the goblet. He grimaced as he swallowed the liquid, his throat working convulsively. "It tastes bitter," Garrick rasped, coughing into a handkerchief that came away spotted with blood. "Worse than before." "Medicine is rarely sweet, my king," Oren replied dismissively, taking the empty goblet. "But it is necessary. Your father suffered from the same weakness of the blood. It is the curse of the lineage." Sam watched from the shadows near the door, her instincts screaming. She knew of the Alpha's curse, stories of kings dying young, but she had never heard of a genetic disorder that caused these specific symptoms. As the liquid settled in Garrick's stomach, Sam saw the reaction. It wasn't relief. It was immediate decline. Garrick's breathing became shallower, his color turned a sickly shade of gray-green, and he slumped further into the chair, his eyes glazing over with exhaustion. The medicine wasn't helping him. It was suppressing him. Sam bit her tongue to keep from shouting. Oren turned and saw her, his eyes flashing with annoyance. "You," he snapped. "What are you doing here? The king needs rest, not interruptions from the help." Sam forced a polite smile, masking the horror churning in her gut. "Apologies, doctor. I took a wrong turn." She backed out of the room, her heart pounding against her ribs. That wasn't medicine. She had seen the way Garrick's body rejected it, the way his wolf spirit seemed to recoil from the substance. Oren was lying about the diagnosis. Chapter 10. Dinner with the King. The sun had set, casting the fortress in deep shadows, but the unease in Sam's chest had not faded. Later that evening, a summons arrived at the nursery. King Garrick requested that Sam and Prince Bram join him for dinner in his private solar. It was a rare invitation, an attempt by the king to spend time with his son, despite his failing health. Sam dressed Bram in his formal tunic and smoothed her own dress, bracing herself for another encounter with the man she now suspected was being slowly murdered. The solar was intimate, a smaller room off the main chambers with a round table set for 3. Garrick was already seated. He had made an effort to look presentable, wearing a clean tunic and sitting upright, but the effort clearly cost him. He smiled when Bram entered, a genuine, warm expression that momentarily erased the pain from his face. "Come, sit," he invited, gesturing to the chairs. The meal was simple: roast chicken, root vegetables, and a hearty soup. For a while, the atmosphere was surprisingly domestic. Garrick asked Bram about his lessons, and he asked Sam about her life in the forest. For the first time, Sam saw the man behind the crown, a father who loved his son fiercely and was terrified of leaving him alone. "The soup is excellent tonight," Garrick remarked, lifting his spoon. "My chef insists on a special broth for my constitution." He took several spoonfuls, savoring the warmth. Sam watched him, her own spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. She hadn't touched the soup yet. She watched Garrick swallow, and within minutes, the change occurred. The warmth left his face. He stopped speaking mid-sentence, his hand flying to his chest as if he had been struck. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on his brow instantly. "Father?" Bram asked, his voice trembling. Garrick waved a hand dismissively, though his fingers were trembling. "I am fine, Bram. Just a sudden wave of fatigue." But he wasn't fine. His pupils were dilated, blowing wide despite the candlelight, and his breathing hitched, sounding wet and labored. Sam stared at the soup bowl in front of the king. It smelled rich and savory, flavored with rosemary and garlic, but beneath the culinary scents, her trained nose caught something else. A faint, sweet, metallic undertone that shouldn't be there. It wasn't the medicine this time. It was the food. Sam's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. It wasn't just Oren's treatments. The poison was in his daily meals. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The king wasn't sick. He was being assassinated by inches, from every direction. Garrick groaned low in his throat, a sound of suppressed agony, and slumped forward, his forehead resting on the table. Bram jumped up, crying out in alarm. Sam sat frozen for a split second, her eyes locking on the half-eaten bowl of soup. If he took another bite, she feared he wouldn't wake up tomorrow. She had to act, and she had to be absolutely certain. Chapter 11. A Dangerous Sample. The atmosphere in the king's private solar shifted from domestic warmth to suffocating dread in the span of a single heartbeat. King Garrick, who moments before had been smiling at his son, was now gripping the edge of the heavy oak table with enough force to turn his knuckles white. A low, suppressed groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony that he was desperately trying to stifle for the sake of the young boy sitting across from him. His skin, which had been pale to begin with, took on a frightening waxen quality, and beads of cold sweat erupted instantly across his forehead, dripping down to stain the collar of his tunic. It was not merely fatigue, as he claimed. It was a visceral, violent reaction occurring deep within his gut, as if his body was actively fighting a war against what he had just consumed. Sam sat frozen for a fraction of a second, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her healer's instincts were screaming loud enough to drown out the crackle of the fireplace. She watched the king's eyes squeeze shut, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid, each inhale sounding wet and labored. Beside her, Prince Bram let out a small, terrified whimper, pushing his chair back as he stared at his father with wide, watery eyes. The boy looked ready to bolt or cry, his small hands trembling as they hovered uselessly over his plate. Sam knew she had to act immediately, not just to help the king, but to secure the proof that would save his life. The soup bowl sat directly in front of Garrick, half empty, the savory steam still rising from it, mocking them with its innocent aroma of rosemary and garlic. "Bram," Sam said, her voice cutting through the rising panic with a sharp, commanding tone that made the boy look at her instantly. She kept her face calm, masking the terror churning in her stomach. "Your father needs water, now. Go to the sideboard and pour a fresh glass from the pitcher. Do not spill it." The specific instruction gave the child a focus, a mission. Bram nodded frantically, scrambling off his chair and rushing toward the heavy wooden sideboard on the far side of the room. His back was turned. Sam moved with the silent, fluid speed of a predator. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron, her fingers closing around the small, empty glass vial she carried for Bram's nightmare tonics. With her eyes locked on the king, who was currently slumped forward with his head in his hands, she uncorked the vial with her thumb. In one smooth motion, she reached across the table, tilted the king's bowl, and poured a generous amount of the remaining soup into the glass container. The liquid was warm against her fingers. She recorked it tightly and shoved it deep into her pocket just as Bram turned around, clutching the goblet of water with 2 hands. Garrick took the water from his son, his hand shaking so violently that water sloshed over the rim and onto his hand. He drank it greedily, the cool liquid seemingly providing a moment of respite from the fire in his veins. He slumped back against the chair, his chest heaving. "Forgive me," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "The weakness? It comes upon me suddenly." He tried to smile at Bram, but it was a grimace of pain. Sam watched him with a mixture of pity and cold fury. He was apologizing for being murdered. "Your Majesty," Sam said, standing up and smoothing her skirts to hide the bulge of the vial in her pocket. "The prince is distressed, and you need rest. I will take him to the nursery." Garrick nodded weakly, unable to argue. "And sire," she added, taking a calculated risk, "I left a specific herb at my mother's cottage that aids with sleep. With your permission, I would like to retrieve it tonight. Bram will sleep better with it." Garrick waved a dismissive hand, his eyes already closing. "Go. Take a horse if you need." "I prefer to walk," Sam replied quickly. She ushered Bram out of the room, her hand firm on his shoulder. Once the boy was tucked into his bed, guarded by the night sentries, Sam changed into a dark cloak. She moved through the stone corridors of the fortress like a ghost, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the high-ranking guards patrolled. The vial in her pocket felt incredibly heavy, a physical weight of treason and salvation. She slipped out through a servant's postern gate, nodding to a drowsy guard who recognized her only as the nursemaid. As she stepped out into the cool night, leaving the looming shadow of the fortress behind her, she broke into a run, the evidence of the king's poisoning slapping rhythmically against her thigh. Chapter 12. The Diagnosis. The village was shrouded in silence, the cobblestone streets empty under the watchful gaze of the moon. Sam didn't slow her pace until she reached the edge of the settlement, where the forest began to reclaim the land. Here stood a small, crooked cottage with a thatched roof that looked as if it had grown out of the earth itself. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, smelling of burning sage and dried roots. Sam banged on the heavy wooden door, the sound sharp and urgent in the quiet night. Moments later, the door creaked open to reveal Matilda. Her mother was a formidable woman, with wild gray hair and eyes that held the same sharp, uncompromising intelligence as Sam's. She didn't ask why her daughter was there in the middle of the night. She simply saw the tension in Sam's jaw and stepped back to let her in. The interior of the cottage was a chaotic sanctuary of hanging herbs, jars of colored powders, and stacks of ancient parchment. It smelled of earth and old magic, a stark contrast to the sterile, cold scent of the castle. "I need your eyes, Mother," Sam said without preamble, pulling the vial from her pocket and setting it on the rough-hewn work table. "This is from the king's table. Tonight. He fell ill immediately after eating it." Matilda's expression darkened instantly. She picked up the vial, holding it up to the candlelight. The thick liquid swirled sluggishly, casting an amber shadow against the wall. "It smells of roast fowl," Matilda muttered, unstopping the cork and taking a cautious sniff. She frowned, her nose twitching. "But there is an sweetness underneath, cloying, like overripe berries rotting in the sun." She moved to her workbench, sweeping aside a pile of dried nettles. She poured a small amount of the soup onto a clean ceramic saucer. From a high shelf, she retrieved a jar containing a fine, iridescent blue powder, crushed petals of the starflower, a rare reagent used to detect impurities in water sources. Sam held her breath as Matilda sprinkled the blue dust over the soup sample. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The soup just sat there, looking like ordinary food. Then, a low hiss filled the room. The blue powder began to bubble and foam, turning a violent, angry red before dissolving into a thick, black sludge that smelled of sulfur. Matilda gasped, recoiling from the table as if the plate had bitten her. She looked at Sam, her face draining of all color. "Nightshade dust," Matilda whispered, the name hanging in the air like a curse. But not the raw plant. This is refined, concentrated. It takes a master alchemist weeks to distill the poison to this potency. She looked back at the black sludge. It mimics the symptoms of a wasting disease: tremors, fatigue, bleeding from the lungs. It kills slowly, shutting down the organs one by one until the heart simply gives out. Sam felt a cold chill wash over her, validating the terror she had felt at dinner. "They claim it is a genetic stress disorder," Sam said, her voice hard and brittle. "Dr. Oren is treating him for it daily." Matilda let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. "Genetic disorder? The only thing wrong with his blood is that someone is pouring poison into it. If Oren is treating him and hasn't found this, then Oren is either the most incompetent healer in the territories, or he is the one holding the spoon." The confirmation was terrifying. The king was isolated, surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of friends. "Can he survive this?" Sam asked, her voice trembling slightly. Matilda nodded grimly. "He is an alpha. His physiology is superior to a human's. His body is fighting it, which is why he is still alive. But he needs clean food, Samantha. Immediately. If he continues to ingest this, even his wolf spirit won't be able to keep his heart beating. The damage will become irreversible." Sam grabbed the empty vial, her knuckles white. She had the truth now, but truth was a dangerous weapon. If she went to the guards, Merrick would silence her. If she confronted Oren, she would be dead by morning. She had to save the king the same way she had saved his son, silently and on her own terms. Chapter 13. The Switch. Sam returned to the fortress just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon. She slipped back into her room, her mind racing with the logistics of a plan that bordered on insanity. She couldn't stop the kitchen from cooking the poisoned food, and she couldn't stop the servers from delivering it without causing a scene that would alert the conspirators. She had to intercept it. The nursery had a small, functional kitchenette used for warming milk and preparing light snacks for the prince. It was stocked with basic supplies: eggs, bread, fresh vegetables, and dried meats. It wasn't a royal banquet, but it was safe. The plan began at lunch. Sam waited in the stone corridor leading to the royal chambers, pretending to examine a tapestry depicting the first Alpha. She heard the rattle of the service cart approaching long before she saw it. It was pushed by a young page boy, nervous and sweaty, struggling with the squeaky wheel. The cart held a silver tray covered by a large dome. Sam stepped out from the wall, blocking the boy's path with an air of absolute authority. "Hold a moment," she said, flashing a warm but firm smile. "The king is currently in a heated debate with his generals. He gave strict orders not to be disturbed for another 20 minutes. If you go in there now, you might lose your head." The page boy's eyes went wide, and he halted the cart instantly. "But the head chef said it must be served hot," he stammered. "And I am telling you that the king's temper is hotter," Sam lied smoothly, stepping closer. "I will take the tray. I have a warmer in the nursery. I will bring it in to him when the meeting concludes. You can go." The boy hesitated only for a second. The prospect of avoiding a shouting king was too appealing to resist. He handed over the cart and scurried away down the hall. Sam wasted no time. She wheeled the cart into the nursery and locked the door behind her. Her heart was pounding against her ribs. She lifted the silver dome. A plate of braised venison sat there, rich and steaming. It looked delicious, but Sam knew it was glazed with death. She scraped the entire meal into a waste bucket, covering it with soiled rags to hide the evidence. Then, she moved to the kitchenette with frantic speed. She grabbed 3 fresh eggs, cracking them into a bowl and whisking them with a pinch of salt and dried herbs from her own stash. She sliced a loaf of uncontaminated bread and toasted it over the small fire. The smell of cooking eggs filled the small room, homely and safe. She arranged the simple meal on the royal plate, making it look as elegant as possible. It wasn't venison, but it wouldn't kill him. She covered it with the dome and wheeled the cart to the king's door, nodding to the guards with a confidence she didn't feel. "His Majesty's lunch," she announced. Inside, Garrick was sitting at his desk, surrounded by maps. He looked gray and exhausted, rubbing his temples. He frowned when he lifted the dome. "Eggs?" he asked, confused. "I thought the menu was venison today." Sam stood by the door, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "The kitchen had a mishap with the meat, sire," she lied. "They sent this apology, fresh and light. They thought it might sit better with your digestion." Garrick sighed, too tired to care or argue. He picked up his fork and took a bite. Sam watched him swallow, holding her breath until her lungs burned. He didn't cringe. He didn't sweat. He ate the entire plate, and for the first time in weeks, the king was fueled by nutrition, not poison. Chapter 14. The King's Strength, 7 Days. That was how long Sam had been running her covert operation within the castle walls. 7 days of lurking in hallways, intercepting trays, bribing page boys with sweets and lies, and cooking frantic, simple meals in the nursery kitchenette. It was exhausting work, leaving her nerves frayed and her hands shaking by evening, but the results were nothing short of miraculous. The change in King Garrick was visible to everyone, though only Sam knew the true cause. The gray, deathly pallor that had clung to his skin like a shroud was gone, replaced by a healthy, sun-touched flush. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, and the constant, rattling cough that had echoed through the throne room had ceased entirely. Sam stood on the high stone balcony of the nursery, the wind whipping at her hair as she looked down at the training grounds below. For the first time in months, King Garrick was down there with his men. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was participating. He held a heavy training sword, the steel gleaming in the afternoon sun, sparring with the captain of the guard. His movements were fluid and powerful, the lethargy of the poison completely flushed from his system by his alpha metabolism. He moved with a predatory grace that made Sam's breath hitch in her throat. She watched as he parried a strike and countered with a move so fast it was a blur, disarming his opponent and sending the sword clattering to the dust. He laughed, a booming, joyous sound that reached all the way up to the balcony, and clapped the captain on the shoulder. Later that afternoon, Garrick came to the nursery to see Bram. He was still wearing his training leathers, and the room was instantly filled with his scent, a potent mix of leather, sweat, and the musk of the alpha. It was a masculine, earthy smell that made the small room feel suddenly intimate. He looked at Sam, his blue eyes clear and piercing, devoid of the glassy haze that had plagued him for weeks. "I feel renewed," he admitted, flexing his hands as if testing the tension in his own muscles. "Dr. Oren says the genetic disorder is in remission. He claims his treatments are finally taking hold." Garrick shook his head, a wry, disbelief-filled smile playing on his lips. "But I think it is the company. Since you and Bram have settled in, the shadows in this castle seem less oppressive." He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space in a way that felt electric rather than threatening. He was so large, so brimming with restored power, that Sam had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The touch sent a jolt of heat straight to Sam's core, making her knees weak. "You have brought life back to this fortress, Sam," he murmured, his voice low and vibrating with sincerity. "I don't know what magic you work in these woods of yours, but I am in your debt." Sam looked up at him, her heart racing against her ribs. He was attributing his health to her presence, unaware of how literal that statement truly was. She wanted to tell him everything, but fear held her tongue. "I just want you to be well, Garrick," she whispered, dropping the formal titles in the heat of the moment. The look he gave her then was not one of a king to a servant, but of a man looking at a woman he was beginning to desire with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Chapter 15. The Brothers Panic. Deep in the bowels of the fortress, far beneath the polished floors of the throne room, lay the royal wine cellar. It was a cold, cavernous space that smelled of dust, fermented grapes, and damp stone. But tonight, it smelled of fear. Lord Merrick paced back and forth between the rows of aged barrels, his footsteps echoing sharply in the silence. He looked nothing like the composed nobleman who held court upstairs. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He kicked a wooden crate, sending it skittering across the floor and smashing into the far wall. He was sparring, Merrick hissed, spinning around to face Dr. Oren, who was standing in the shadows, wringing his hands. He was on the training grounds for 2 hours, laughing, fighting. He was supposed to be bedridden by now. He was supposed to be coughing up blood and preparing his last will and testament. Merrick's voice rose to a shout, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The crown was so close he could almost feel the weight of it on his brow, and yet it was slipping through his fingers like water. Dr. Oren looked equally disturbed, his usual arrogance replaced by confusion. He adjusted his white robes nervously. "I don't understand it," the physician muttered, staring at the floor. "The dosage in the food is lethal. I prepared the nightshade dust myself. Even an alpha shouldn't be able to metabolize that amount of toxin and remain standing, let alone recover this quickly." Oren began to pace as well, his brow furrowed. "Unless he isn't eating it. But the trays come back empty. The scullery maids confirm it every day. He eats everything." "Then the dosage is too low," Merrick snapped, advancing on the doctor. "Your science is failing, Oren. And if he recovers, if he regains his full strength, he will sniff us out. He is already asking questions about the border patrols I reassigned. He is waking up, and when the Alpha wakes up, he hunts." Merrick grabbed the physician by the collar of his pristine robes, pulling him close until their noses were almost touching. "We cannot wait for the slow death anymore. We don't have the time." Oren pulled away, smoothing his robes with indignant dignity. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though the fear in his eyes said he already knew. "I am suggesting we finish it," Merrick growled, his eyes cold and dead, void of any brotherly love. "Tonight, no more slow wasting. We use the concentrate, the final dose." Oren's eyes widened in horror. "That is incredibly risky. It kills instantly. It mimics a massive heart seizure. It will be obvious it wasn't natural. The council will investigate." "I don't care if it looks like a lightning strike," Merrick roared, slamming his fist against a wine barrel. "As long as he is dead, I become regent for the boy. I control the narrative. I control the council. We do it at lunch tomorrow. Find a way to get it into his food. If the kitchen staff are incompetent, find someone who can be coerced. But Garrick does not survive another sunrise." The decision was made. Desperation had replaced caution, and the conspirators were now willing to burn the entire kingdom down to get what they wanted. Chapter 16. The Kitchen Servant. The royal kitchens of the fortress were usually a place of organized chaos, filled with the clatter of copper pans, the shouting of chefs, and the heavy, savory scents of roasting meats. But in the quiet hour between the lunch rush and the dinner preparations, the vast stone room was eerily still. Willa, a young scullery maid with hands roughened by lye soap and freezing water, was alone at the scrubbing basin, her back to the door. She hummed a quiet, trembling tune to herself, trying to ignore the gnawing anxiety that had settled in her chest over the last few weeks. The tension in the castle was palpable, trickling down from the high lords to the lowest servants, and everyone walked on eggshells. The heavy wooden door creaked open, admitting a draft of cold air that raised goose flesh on Willa's arms. She turned, expecting the head chef to bark an order about peeling more potatoes. Instead, she dropped her scrubbing brush with a wet splash. Standing in the doorway, framed by the shadows of the corridor, was Lord Merrick. He looked out of place among the grime and grease of the scullery, his velvet doublet pristine and his boots polished to a mirror shine. He didn't speak immediately. He simply closed the door behind him and slid the iron bolt into place with a definitive click. My lord, Willa stammered, wiping her wet hands on her apron and dropping into a clumsy curtsy. I didn't know you were coming down here. I can fetch the chef. Stay where you are, Willa, Merrick commanded, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the flagstones. He stopped only when he was close enough that she could smell the expensive musk of his cologne, a scent that clotted in her throat. I have a task for you, a task that requires discretion and a steady hand. He reached into his doublet and withdrew a small dark glass vial. It was no larger than her thumb, but the liquid inside was black and viscous, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Willa stared at the vial, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew what this was. Everyone in the castle whispered about the king's illness, and deep down, the servants knew it wasn't natural. I don't understand, she whispered, backing away until her hips hit the cold stone of the sink. You don't need to understand, Merrick said, his eyes hardening into flint. You are serving the king his lunch today. The usual server has been detained. You will take this vial, and you will pour every drop of it into his soup just before you enter his chambers. Willa shook her head frantically, tears welling in her eyes. Please, my lord, I can't. That's treason. That's murder. The king— Merrick cut her off by grabbing her chin, his fingers digging into her jaw with bruising force. The king is dying anyway. I am merely ending his suffering. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a serpentine hiss. And if you refuse, Willa, I will have your little brother, the one who works in the stables, arrested for theft. The punishment for a servant stealing from the crown is the loss of a hand, or perhaps a hanging. Do we have an understanding? Willa sobbed, her resistance shattering under the weight of the threat. She took the vial with shaking fingers, the glass feeling like ice against her skin. Chapter 17. Shadows in the hallway. Sam stood near the junction of the grand corridor, pretending to adjust the fastenings on her cloak while she watched the flow of the castle. For the past week, her life had become a series of calculated interceptions. She knew the schedule of the kitchen staff better than the head steward did. She knew which page boy pushed the cart, which guard was prone to napping, and exactly how many seconds she had to swap the plates. But today, the rhythm was off. The usual rattle of the service cart was late, and the air in the hallway felt heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Then she saw it. The cart turned the corner, but it wasn't the page boy pushing it. It was a young woman Sam recognized from the lower scullery, Willa. The girl looked like she was walking to her own execution. Her face was the color of parchment, drained of all blood, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill of the stone corridor. Her hands gripped the handle of the cart so tightly that her knuckles were stark white, and she walked with a stiff, jerky gait, her eyes darting nervously toward every shadow. Sam's instincts flared instantly. This wasn't right. The scullery maids never served the king directly. That was a task reserved for senior pages or stewards. Why was a girl who scrubbed pots pushing the royal lunch? Sam pushed off the wall, moving quietly to follow her. She kept her distance, hugging the shadows of the tapestries, her gaze locked on the girl's trembling form. As Willa approached the heavy oak doors of the king's antechamber, she stopped. She looked around frantically, checking for witnesses. Seeing the corridor apparently empty, she reached into the pocket of her apron. Sam saw the glint of dark glass. It wasn't the subtle dusting of powder they had been using before. This was a vial, and the girl was uncorking it with clumsy, terrified fingers. She lifted the silver dome covering the king's meal. Sam didn't need to be a wolf to smell the danger. A sharp, acrid scent wafted down the hall, chemical and bitter, smelling of burnt almonds and death. This wasn't the slow poison. This was something immediate, something final. Panic surged through Sam, cold and electric. If that liquid touched the food, there would be no time for antidotes or healers. The king would be dead before he finished the first spoonful. Sam abandoned all pretense of stealth. She launched herself forward, her boots pounding against the stone floor. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a crack of thunder. Willa jumped violently, nearly dropping the vial. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, seeing Sam sprinting toward her. Panic took over the girl's reason. Instead of hiding the vial, she tried to hurriedly dump the contents onto the plate, desperate to complete her task before she was stopped. "No!" Willa cried out, a sound of pure desperation. Sam covered the distance in seconds. She didn't have time to be gentle. She lunged for the cart, her hand shooting out to grab the maid's wrist just as the vial tilted over the steaming bowl of soup. Chapter 18. The Interception. The impact was jarring. Sam collided with Willa, her fingers clamping around the girl's wrist like an iron manacle. The force of the tackle shoved Willa back against the stone wall with a heavy thud, and the service cart rattled violently, nearly tipping over. The vial flew from Willa's grasp, spinning through the air in a dark arc before shattering against the floor stones. The black liquid splashed outward, hissing as it made contact with the rock. Smoke curled up instantly from the spill, white and acrid, and the stone itself seemed to groan as the acid ate into the surface, leaving behind a bubbling, pitted scar. Silence descended on the corridor, broken only by the sizzling of the poison and Willa's ragged, terrified sobs. Sam stood over the girl, breathing hard, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She looked from the smoking ruin on the floor to the trembling servant. The visual proof was undeniable. If that had gone down Garrick's throat, it would have dissolved him from the inside out. It was a weapon of war, not a tool of politics. "Look at it," Sam commanded, her voice shaking with rage as she pointed at the floor. "Look at what you were about to feed him." Willa couldn't look. She slid down the wall, burying her face in her knees, rocking back and forth. "He said he would hurt my brother," she wailed, her voice muffled and hysterical. "Lord Merrick. He said he would take his hands. I didn't have a choice." The name hung in the air, confirming everything Sam had suspected but had been unable to prove. Merrick, the king's own blood. The betrayal was absolute. Before Sam could respond, the heavy doors to the king's chambers flew open. The noise of the struggle had alerted the occupants. 2 royal guards stepped out, spears leveled, followed immediately by King Garrick. He looked ready for a fight, his hand gripping the hilt of a sword he had grabbed from the wall. "What is the meaning of this?" Garrick roared, his eyes scanning the scene. The overturned cart, the sobbing maid, and Sam standing amidst the chaos. Then his gaze fell on the smoking patch of stone floor. He stopped, his nostrils flaring as he took in the chemical scent of the final dose. His face went rigid, the color draining from his cheeks not from sickness, but from the dawning, horrific realization of how close he had just come to the end. Sam stepped forward, placing herself between the king and the poison, as if the fumes alone could still hurt him. "It was an assassination attempt, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the shaking of her hands. "This girl was coerced. Lord Merrick gave her the vial." Garrick stared at her, then at Willa. The rage that entered his eyes was terrifying, a cold blue fire that promised devastation. He looked at the guards. "Seize her," he commanded, pointing at Willa. "Bring her inside, and bring the herbalist. No one leaves this wing." Chapter 19. The Interrogation. The doors to the royal chambers slammed shut, sealing the 4 of them inside: the king, Sam, the weeping Willa, and the captain of the guard. The room felt too small for the magnitude of the king's fury. Garrick paced back and forth, a predator in a cage, his hand still gripping his sword so tightly the leather of the hilt creaked. He looked at Willa, who was kneeling on the rug, trembling so violently she looked like she might shatter. "My brother," Garrick said, his voice low and dangerous, vibrating with the growl of his inner wolf. "You accuse my brother of high treason. Do you realize the weight of those words, girl? If you are lying to save your own skin, I will have you exiled to the wastelands." Willa shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "I swear it, sire. I swear on the graves of my ancestors." She choked out the story, spilling everything in a torrent of fear. She told him about Merrick coming to the scullery, about the threat to her brother in the stables, about the black vial. Then, seeing that she had nothing left to lose, she continued. "And it wasn't just him. Dr. Oren, he was there too, before, whispering with Finch in the laundry. They laughed about how long it was taking you to die." Garrick stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his back to the room. The betrayal of a brother was a knife to the heart, but the involvement of the physician and the servant Finch painted a picture of a conspiracy that had been rotting his court from the inside out for months. He turned slowly, his face a mask of cold, deadly resolve. "Finch," he repeated. "The man who kidnapped my son. Oren, the man who poisoned my blood. And Merrick, the man who wants my crown." He looked at Sam. "You were right. You were right about everything." Sam stepped forward, her heart aching for the pain she saw in his eyes. "We have the truth, Garrick, but we need more than a servant's confession to take down a high lord. If you arrest Merrick now based on her word, he will deny it. He will say she is mad or that I bribed her. He has allies on the council. We need him to expose himself." Garrick sheathed his sword with a savage snap. "Exposure is not enough. I want them destroyed. I want them to feel the cold of the abyss." He looked at Sam, trusting her tactical mind more than his own fury in this moment. "How do we do it? How do we catch them with their hands on the dagger?" Sam looked at Willa, then back to the king. A plan formed in her mind, risky, theatrical, and dangerous. "They think you are dying," she said softly. "They think Willa succeeded, or at least they are waiting for the news. Let's give it to them. Not your death, but the fear of it. We invite them to celebrate. We let them think they have won, and then we let them eat from their own plate." Chapter 20. The Bait. The sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the fortress walls. The mood in the castle was confused and hushed. Rumors were flying. Some said the king had collapsed, others said he was in a coma. The confusion was exactly what Sam had orchestrated. From the royal apartments, a formal summons was issued, stamped with the king's seal but written in a shaky, erratic hand that mimicked the tremors of a dying man. Lord Merrick received the scroll in his study. He broke the wax seal, his fingers trembling with anticipation. He read the words, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "To my beloved brother, my strength fails me. The end draws near. I must name a regent to guide Bram. Come to a private feast. A final appreciation for your loyalty." Merrick laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet room. He turned to Dr. Oren, who was pacing by the window. "It is done," Merrick proclaimed, waving the parchment. The maid succeeded, or the cumulative effect finally broke him. "He is calling us to his deathbed to hand me the keys to the kingdom." Oren read the note, relief washing over his features. Finally, the genetic lie could only hold for so long. We must go immediately. We must ensure the transition is legal before he breathes his last. Neither of them suspected a trap. Their arrogance was their blinder. They believed so fully in their own intellect and the king's weakness that they couldn't conceive of a counterplay. An hour later, the great doors of the private dining hall were thrown open. Merrick and Oren entered, dressed in somber colors that barely concealed their triumph. Finch, the rat-faced servant, trailed behind them, having been promised a promotion for his silence. The room was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners. At the head of the long table sat King Garrick. He was slumped in his chair, a heavy fur cloak draped over his shoulders as if he were freezing. His head hung low, his face shadowed. Sam stood in the corner, almost invisible in the gloom, watching. She saw the way Merrick's eyes lit up when he saw his brother's weakened posture, She saw the smug look Oren exchanged with Finch. They walked to the table, bowing low, a mockery of respect. "Brother," Merrick said, his voice dripping with faux concern. "We came as soon as we heard. Is it time?" Garrick didn't look up. He lifted a trembling hand, gesturing to the seats across from him. "Sit," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I have much to say, and little time." The conspirators sat, their eyes gleaming. Servants, loyal guards dressed in tunic and hose, brought out covered platters and flagons of wine. The trap was set. They believed they were attending a funeral feast, unaware that the king was merely waiting for the moment to spring the jaws shut. Chapter 21. The Feast of Fools. The private dining hall was a cavern of shadows and flickering candlelight, the atmosphere heavy with a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. King Garrick sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a figure of tragic decline. He was slumped deep into his high-backed chair, his chin resting on his chest, and his hands, usually so steady with a sword, trembled visibly where they rested on the velvet tablecloth. To his right sat Lord Merrick, his face composed into a mask of brotherly sorrow that barely concealed the gleam of triumph in his eyes. To his left sat Dr. Oren, who kept glancing at the king's chest, waiting for the final rattle of breath that would signal the end of his treasonous work. At the far end of the table, Finch fidgeted with his napkin, his eyes darting around the room, terrified of the company he was keeping, but greedy for the reward he had been promised. Servants moved silently around the perimeter of the room, placing silver platters of roasted meats, glazed root vegetables, and freshly baked bread onto the table. The aroma was rich and intoxicating, but no one reached for the food. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on everyone present. Merrick poured himself a goblet of wine, the crimson liquid swirling in the glass as he raised it to his lips. He watched his brother over the rim, savoring the moment. He had waited years for this. He had plotted, schemed, and killed, and now the crown was finally within his grasp. He could already feel the weight of the iron circlet on his brow, could already hear the cheers of the pack as he ascended the throne. "The food looks adequate," Merrick said, breaking the silence with a voice that was smooth and oily. "It is a pity you have no appetite, brother, but we must keep our strength up. The kingdom will need strong leadership in the difficult days ahead." He placed a heavy emphasis on the word difficult, a subtle reminder to Oren and Finch that their roles were about to become very important. Garrick didn't respond immediately. He let out a low, wheezing cough, his shoulders shaking with the effort. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes clouded and unfocused, staring past Merrick at some invisible point on the wall. "Leadership," Garrick rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, the pack must survive. It must act with integrity." Merrick smirked, mistaking the word for a plea. "Do not worry, Garrick. I will ensure the pack is led with the strength it deserves. I will scour the weakness from our ranks." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I will make sure young Bram is guided properly. He is too soft, like his mother. But I will harden him. I will make him a true alpha." At the mention of his son, Garrick's hand twitched on the table. It was a small movement, but Oren, ever the observer of physiology, narrowed his eyes. For a split second, the tremor didn't look like weakness. It looked like restraint. But the moment passed, and Garrick slumped again, letting out a long, shuddering sigh. "The soup," the king whispered, gesturing weakly to the large silver tureen that had been placed in front of him. "My special broth. I wish to propose a toast." Merrick signaled the server. "Pour the king his soup, and pour wine for the rest of us. We will toast to the future." The server, a man Merrick didn't recognize, a guard in disguise, stepped forward. He ladled the steaming broth into Garrick's bowl. The scent of it wafted across the table. To Merrick and Oren, it smelled like victory. They believed it contained the final dose, the lethal concentrate Willa had been ordered to administer. They watched with bated breath, waiting for the king to lift the spoon to his lips and take the bite that would end his reign. The anticipation was electric, a buzzing energy that made Finch sweat profusely in his seat. They were vultures circling a dying lion, ready to pick the bones before the body was even cold. Chapter 22. The Shared Plate. The spoon hovered halfway to King Garrick's mouth. His hand was shaking violently, the liquid rippling in the silver bowl of the utensil. Lord Merrick leaned forward involuntarily, his eyes wide and hungry, his breath hitched in his throat. Dr. Oren had stopped breathing entirely, his medical mind already calculating how many seconds it would take for the cardiac arrest to set in once the liquid touched the king's tongue. Even Finch had stopped fidgeting, staring at the spoon with a mixture of horror and fascination. The entire room seemed to narrow down to that single point of focus, the distance between the spoon and the king's lips. Then the shaking stopped. It didn't fade gradually, it ceased instantly. King Garrick's hand became as steady as a stone. The spoon hung perfectly still in the air. Slowly, deliberately, Garrick lowered the spoon back into the bowl with a soft clink that sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in the silence. He didn't look up yet. He simply sat there, his shoulders broadening, his spine straightening as the slump of the dying man evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The air in the room shifted, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees as a wave of pure, unadulterated power began to radiate from the head of the table. "You know," Garrick said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in the chests of the men across from him. "I have always believed that a king should share his bounty with his most loyal subjects." He looked up then. The cloudy, unfocused gaze was gone. In its place were eyes of piercing, icy blue, burning with a clarity and intelligence that terrified them. He wasn't looking at them with affection. He was looking at them with the cold, predatory assessment of a wolf facing down a threat. Merrick's smile faltered, the glass of wine in his hand tilting dangerously. "Brother?" he asked, his voice cracking on the word. You seem improved." "Improved?" Garrick let out a short, sharp laugh that held no humor. He stood up. He didn't struggle to rise. He flowed upward with the effortless power of an apex predator. He towered over the table, casting a long shadow over the conspirators. "I feel excellent, Merrick. In fact, I have never felt better. And because I am feeling so generous, I cannot possibly eat this delicious soup all by myself." He gestured to the bowl in front of him, the bowl Merrick and Oren believed was laced with instant death. "Steward," Garrick commanded, his voice booming off the stone walls. "Divide my portion. Give a bowl to Lord Merrick, Dr. Oren, and our friend Finch. They look famished." The color drained from Merrick's face so fast it looked as if he had been struck. Oren let out a strangled gasp, knocking over his wine goblet. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like a bloodstain, but no one moved to clean it up. The disguised guard stepped forward immediately, ladling the soup from the king's tureen into 3 smaller bowls. They placed the bowls directly in front of the 3 men. The steam rose up, carrying the savory scent that now smelled like the grave. "Eat," Garrick ordered, his voice dropping to a growl. He picked up his own wineglass, watching them over the rim. "It is a delicacy, prepared especially for me. Surely you wouldn't refuse a meal from your king's own table? To refuse would be an insult. And in these difficult times, insults can be treated as treason." Finch began to weep openly, tears tracking through the grime on his face. He stared at the soup as if it were a coiled snake. Oren was shaking his head frantically, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his fingernails were digging into the wood. Merrick sat frozen, his mind racing. He knew what was in that soup. He had ordered it. If he ate it, he died. If he refused, he admitted he knew it was poisoned. It was the perfect trap. The king wasn't dying. He was hunting. And they were the prey. Chapter 23. The Truth Exposed. "I said eat," Garrick roared, slamming his fist onto the table. The plates jumped, and the silverware clattered violently. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the confined space. Finch let out a high-pitched yelp and shoved his bowl away, scrambling backward in his chair until he fell onto the floor. "I can't!" the servant screamed, curling into a ball. "I can't eat it! It's poison! It's all poison!" The confession hung in the air, naked and undeniable. Dr. Oren closed his eyes, accepting his fate, his shoulders slumping in defeat. But Lord Merrick was not ready to yield. He stood up, knocking his chair over, his face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "Silence, you fool," he hissed at Finch, then turned his glare on Garrick. "This is madness. You are mad. I will not be subjected to this theater. I am your brother. I am a lord of the realm." "You are a fratricide and a traitor," a female voice cut through the shouting. The side door opened, and Sam stepped into the light. She was dressed not in her servant's garb, but in a formal gown of deep forest green, looking every bit the noblewoman she was in spirit. Beside her, flanked by guards, was Willa. The maid was pale but determined, her eyes locked on Merrick. Merrick sneered at Sam. "The nursemaid. I should have had you killed the moment you walked out of those woods." "You tried," Sam replied calmly, walking until she stood beside the king. "You tried to kill the prince. You tried to kill the king. But you failed." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the shattered remains of the black vial she had recovered from the hallway floor, the one Willa had dropped. "We have the evidence, Merrick. We have the testimony of the maid you coerced. And now we have your refusal to eat the very meal you prepared for your brother. If it was safe, you would have eaten it. Your fear condemns you." Merrick looked around the room. The guards had drawn their swords, blocking every exit. He was trapped. His composure shattered. He lunged for the knife on the table, a desperate, animalistic attempt to fight his way out. "I should have ruled!" he screamed, swinging the blade wildly. "You are weak! You let feelings rule you! I would have made us strong!" Garrick didn't even draw his sword. He moved with a speed that blurred the eye. He caught Merrick's wrist in midair, twisting it with a sickening crunch of bone. Merrick howled, dropping the knife. Garrick shoved him backward, sending him crashing into the wall next to the cowering Finch. "Strength?" Garrick growled, looming over his fallen brother. "You think poisoning your kin is strength? You think kidnapping a child is power? You are nothing but a coward who hides in the shadows." Garrick turned to the guards, his voice turning into cold iron. "Arrest them. All of them. Strip them of their titles, their crests, and their names. They are no longer of this pack." As the guards hauled the struggling men to their feet, Oren began to beg, babbling about scientific curiosity and coercion, but Garrick ignored him. He looked at Sam, the fire in his eyes softening just a fraction. "It is over," he said, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind a weary relief. "The rot is cut out." Sam looked at the three men being dragged toward the door, the brother, the doctor, and the servant. The triad of treason that had nearly brought the kingdom to its knees. She felt no pity, only a deep, resounding satisfaction. Justice had been served, not by the sword, but by the truth. "Not just cut out," she corrected gently, placing a hand on Garrick's arm. "Burned out. Now the healing can finally begin." Chapter 24. The Frozen Abyss. The trial was swift, public, and absolute. The evidence Sam and Willa provided was insurmountable, and the public refusal of the food at the feast was the final nail in the coffin. The entire court gathered in the great hall to hear the king's judgment. Garrick sat on his throne, Prince Bram seated on a smaller chair beside him. The boy looked healthy and safe, a living testament to the failure of the conspirators' plans. Merrick, Oren, and Finch knelt in the center of the room, bound in heavy iron chains that suppressed their wolf spirits. They looked small and pathetic now, stripped of their finery and their arrogance. Lord Merrick, Dr. Oren, Finch, Garrick's voice carried to the furthest corners of the hall. For the crimes of high treason, attempted regicide, and the kidnapping of the Crown Prince, I sentence you to the frozen abyss. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The abyss was a dungeon deep beneath the northern mountains, a place of eternal ice and darkness where no light ever reached. It was a fate worse than death. It was a living erasure. You sought to bring cold death to this house, Garrick continued. Now, the cold shall be your only companion for the rest of your days. Take them away. As the guards dragged the screaming men out of the hall, Garrick turned his attention to Willa. The girl trembled, expecting the worst. Willa, the king said, his voice softer, you aided in a plot to kill your king, but you also provided the testimony that saved us. For your aid, your life is spared. But you can no longer remain here. You are banished from the Packlands. Go, and never return. Willa wept with relief, bowing low before fleeing the hall, grateful for a mercy she knew she barely deserved. The hall emptied slowly until only the king's inner circle remained. Garrick stood and walked down the dais to where Sam was waiting. She had packed her bag that morning, assuming her job was done. The threat was gone, the prince was safe, and the king was healthy. It was time for her to return to her cabin in the woods. She curtsied low. Your Majesty, with the danger past, I will take my leave. My garden needs tending. Garrick reached out, taking her hands in his. His grip was warm and firm, sending a jolt of electricity through her. Your garden can wait, he said, his blue eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. My kingdom cannot. You saved my son when I could not. You saved my life when I didn't even know it was in danger. You have more courage and integrity than any noble in this court. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I don't want a nursemaid, Sam. I don't want a healer. I want the woman who stood between me and death. I want the woman who loves my son as if he were her own. He raised a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin. I am asking you to stay, not as a servant, but as my equal. My partner. Sam's heart hammered against her ribs. Garrick, she whispered. I am just a woman from the woods. I don't know how to be a queen. You are already a queen, Garrick replied, leaning his forehead against hers. You rule with a heart that is fierce and true. That is all that matters. He pulled back slightly, looking deep into her eyes. Be my Luna, Sam. Be my mate. Tears pricked Sam's eyes. She thought of her quiet life, her solitary cabin, and then she looked at the man in front of her, the wounded wolf she had healed, the king she had fought for. She looked at Bram, who was watching them with a hopeful grin. She realized her home wasn't in the woods anymore. It was here, with them. Yes, she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. I will. Garrick roared with joy, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around as Bram ran to join them. In the heart of the fortress that had once been a trap, a new family was forged, strong, whole, and unbreakable. And that is the story of how Sam went from a reclusive healer to the Luna of the kingdom. I honestly think that dinner party scene where Garrick made them eat the soup was one of the most satisfying moments of justice we've ever had on this channel. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a massive thumbs up right now. It really helps support the channel. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when our next shifter romance drops. I asked at the beginning, but if you missed it, I'd love to know who is listening. Scroll down and drop a comment telling me where you are listening from today. It's amazing to see the pack joining in from all over the world. Also, I want to hear your thoughts on the plot. What was your absolute favorite part of the story? Was it the moment Sam tackled the maid in the hallway? The reveal of the poison? Or seeing the villains dragged off to the frozen abyss? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.